Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at the National Firearms Centre. This is part of the British Royal Armouries in Leeds. And today we are taking a look at an extra-light model of Maxim machine gun. This is actually an air-cooled Maxim, which is, well, they didn't make very many models of air-cooled guns. One of the distinctive features about the Maxim was its distinctive water jacket. However, around 1895, the Colt company in the United States introduced the air-cooled Colt Browning machine gun, and that thing started to look fairly appealing to a lot of militaries because it was a pretty lightweight gun compared to the Maxim. So most of the Maxim guns out there were over 100 pounds with their mounts, and the Colt was substantially less, like half that weight. So in order to try and compete, Hiram Maxim put together an air-cooled, extra lightweight version of his gun, and this is one of them. There is still a jacket out here because in order for the Maxim system to work, you have to support the muzzle of the barrel as well as the rear end of the barrel so that the barrel can reciprocate back and forth. That's why he couldn't just leave the brass off entirely. However, he maybe didn't quite do the best version of this for an air-cooled jacket that he could have. We'll touch on that in a moment. At any rate, the idea here was, aside from just being lighter, and this comes in at between 27 and 28 pounds for the gun, which is like half the weight of a typical Maxim, and then not much more with the tripod. It's like 44.5 pounds with the tripod. So there's actually a rather famous picture of Hiram Maxim, or a published picture of him, holding one of these with its tripod out at arm's length, just to prove that he could. Now, 44.5 pounds out there, he probably didn't hold it very long, but it made for a really good publicity photo. The Maxim company was hoping, like their intended market for this thing was really cavalry, because without the water jacket, it didn't have the same sustained fire capability as a typical standard Maxim. It was still belt fed, it still had the rate of fire, it had the potential firepower, but it would overheat fairly quickly because, well, it wasn't very well cooled. So the idea was give it to cavalry who are going to use it in sort of hit and run things where they're not going to be needing really sustained fire. The coolest thing that they did with this was actually a two-person tricycle, or a tricycle, that held two of these guns at the back and had like folding tripod stabilizer legs. It's extremely cool. But at any rate, there's really one main change that they made between the standard Maxim and this, aside from the air cooling. Let me go ahead and show you that on the inside. One of the coolest things about early Maxims like this is the awesome brass work and the markings on them, which are really neat. So this one is no exception. Maxim's patent. At this point, they had amalgamated with Nordenfelt, and so this is the Maxim Nordenfelt company in London. Maxim guns were numbered sequentially from the very first production through. They didn't start new numbers for new contracts. So this is actually the 5,414th Maxim gun manufactured. These were made in 1895. And I'm sorry, it's Maxim Nordenfelt Guns and Ammunition Company. And then the specifics of the cartridge are marked a little farther down on the jacket. This is in 303 British for the British military, which is probably part of why this one ended up in the pattern room collection and now the NFC. Because it was so lightweight, they made sure to mark that on the jacket so that you didn't forget it. It's apparently a little closer to 28 pounds, but it's marked 27. Now, I mentioned that the jacket had to be on the barrel in order to make the gun work, to support the muzzle. However, it is odd that it's not ventilated on the top. There are only 4 ventilation holes, and they're only on the bottom of the water jacket, well, the air jacket now. And this was really the main problem with the ultralight or extra-light Maxim, is that the barrel was relatively heavy, but once the barrel heated up, all that heat stayed inside this brass jacket, and it really had no good way to dissipate or be cooled. You wouldn't think that it would take that much of a leap to drill more holes in the jacket, but that's one of the things about early developmental guns. This is 1895. There weren't any recoil-operated air-cooled machine guns out there at all. This was the first of them. So we have to give some leeway to people who are having to come up with entirely new concepts, even when those concepts look to us really obvious in retrospect. We're the ones who get to look at everything that already exists and then decide how obvious it is. So of course, this thing is mounted on a little pedestal here, and I'm leaving it on that mount. That's why that's down there. Because this is such a narrow gun, it doesn't have spade grips on it. It has a single, rather somewhat modern-like pistol grip with a regular trigger. We have a safety lever here that, in the upward position, physically locks the trigger. So that's your safety. This pattern was one of the first to actually use the roller bearing back here. The earlier black powder Maxims had a solid flat stop that the crank handle would run into. On this one, you have a much smoother operation with the curved surface here and the roller bearing. And of course, Maxim patented all of this sort of stuff as he went along in the development process. If you're familiar with the Maxim and Vickers guns, you will notice that while this has a roller bearing, it doesn't have the anti-bounce lock on it that you would see, for example, on Vickers guns. That will come later. That's the next subsequent development that hasn't happened when this one's being built. Again, in light of this being a slicked up, lightened, and shrunk down Maxim gun, instead of having a big vertical tangent sight on the top cover, they instead have a sight mounted here on the very back plate. This one is unfortunately stuck in place, but there's a little locking screw down here, and then you can slide this up and down. Have a little range scale there on the back to set a range out to 2,000 meters, or 2,000 yards it would have been here. The rear sight is a little V-notch there, offset to the left side of the gun so that you can still clear the latch to open the top cover here, because this lifts up like that, so you do need some space there. And then the front sight is just a big, basically conical peg stuck into the very front of the top cover. Now what you may have noticed is missing is the Fuji cover, Fuji spring and cover here on the side. That is the major difference between this and a standard pattern of Maxim gun, aside from the size and the water. They moved the Fuji spring to the inside. So I can open this up, just like a typical Maxim. The whole top cover lifts off. And there you can see our mainspring on the inside of the gun. Now, one might ask, why didn't they do this standard for all the Maxims? It seems like a real advantage to have that spring on the inside instead of hanging out on the outside of the gun where it can be damaged or, just get in the way and make the whole gun wider. Well, there are a couple reasons. One of them is you can't easily remove the lock in this gun without first having to remove the spring, which is a bit annoying. You also don't have any way to adjust the tension on that spring. And that was one of the big considerations with the Maxim gun in an era when ammunition was in particular not necessarily all that consistent, certainly not as consistent as we have come to be used to today. You needed a way to be able to adjust the tension to get the guns to run at the proper harmonic, to get them to run correctly. And with this, you don't have that option. So these guns were, the factory sets it up, and that's what you get. And if your ammo is too heavy or too light, you're kind of just out of luck. And that does make sense to me why this would not be continued, this particular feature in the standard pattern guns. Aside from that difference, this is going to run like a standard Maxim gun. So we have, of course, the whole cycle of the toggle lock there, coming back. There is no top pin on this, by the way, which is also a little bit of a development departure. So on this one, as soon as you open the top cover, the pistol grip can pivot down on a single pin at the bottom. On normal Maxims, there's a second pin up here to hold this in place. And that's one of the things that just had to be gotten rid of to lighten the gun up. So to have a second pin here would require a metal block up here. They shaved weight on this everywhere that they could get away with it. They had to. As with a typical Maxim, we can just slide the feed block right out of the receiver there. And it's one of the really cool early cast brass, really quite beautiful feed block styles. You actually have rollers here to ease feeding of the belt. This lever drops the cartridge stop in there, which allows you to pull out a belt that still has cartridges in it. And then, of course, we have the barrel here, the brass trunnion there, And when the gun recoils, like so, you can see this action arm comes back. That action arm locks into this lug so that as the action arm moves, the feed block here cycles in and out to pull cartridges into the gun. In total, they only made 135 of these guns. It was a complete commercial failure. Virtually all the ones that they did make were sold in little orders of 1 and 2 all over the world. And that's kind of typical of especially the very early Maxims. A lot of countries were interested but skeptical and thought, well, we'll give this a try, but they're pretty expensive, and I don't know that we want to, buy 1,000 of them to equip the entire military right off the bat. We'll just start by ordering 1 or 2. And that was pretty much the story for all of these extra-light guns. They didn't last very long. They were actually tested by the U.S. military, who rather liked them, but found the sustained fire capacity insufficient for U.S. use. So they did keep Maxim in the U.S. trials, at least for a little while, which would turn out well for Maxim, because in 1904, the U.S. Army would adopt a heavy, full-size, standard water-cooled Maxim for the United States. Never saw that much use. We never had all that many of them, but this was part of the process in getting that gun adopted. So this is, of course, at the National Firearms Center in Leeds, and I'd like to give a big thanks to them for giving me access to show it to you. 135 of them made. I don't know how many survived, but it's not very many, and it's a really cool, unusual pattern of Maxim gun. So if you're interested in visiting the NFC, they have perhaps the best gun collection in Western Europe. It is accessible not to the general public, but it is accessible by appointment to researchers. So if you have a good reason to come in here and poke through their guns, call them up. In fact, there's a link to their website in the description below, and they will be very friendly people and do their best to accommodate your visit. Thanks for watching.